Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on what is a beautiful, somewhat smoky summer day. We have a really interesting presentation for you today, and we're going to be covering a wide variety of summer safety topics to help you keep your workers, yourselves, and your family safe. So to jump in, I'd like to introduce our presenters today. So we have three ECOHites, Marianne and Taylor and Lisa. Lisa Scalero is ECOH's Director of Health and Safety and has been involved in the development of health, safety, and environmental programs for a myriad of clients across Canada. And Taylor Broughton is an occupational hygienist at ECOH. Her dedication to research and commitment to excellence was recognized in her Student Award of Excellence by the Occupational Hygiene Association of Ontario. So we're lucky to have Taylor on board. And Marianne Levitsky as well, ECOH's Senior Associate. She's a Distinguished Fellow of the American Industrial Hygiene Association, and she's been advising ECOH and our clients for over 15 years. So really grateful to have you all with us today. So in our summer safety webinar, we're going to give you a little bit of an introduction to ECOH, who we are and what we do. Lisa is going to be touching on poisonous plants and insidious insects, and Taylor will be talking to us about water safety. And then Marianne will be closing off our section on heat stress and wildfire smoke and respiratory safety, which is particularly relevant today. And just a very brief closure on how ECOH can help with some of these things. So ECOH is an environmental consulting, occupational health and safety company. We were founded in 2000. We're celebrating our 23rd birthday this year. And we have service hubs in Mississauga and Ottawa. With more than 75 professionally accredited staff, we service a lot of sectors, including buildings, real estate, healthcare, manufacturing, and insurance, as well as some others. We have three main service lines. We do environmental work, phase 1, phase 2, underground storage tanks, groundwater, soil remediation, those kinds of things. Hazardous materials, our team here focuses on designated substances and asbestos, particularly, and then our occupational health and safety division looks at various health and safety audits, water, mold, bacteria, indoor air quality assessments and plans. And so now, without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Lisa, who will be talking to us about insects and plants. Thanks so much, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Gnomes. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. So recognizing that this is a very large subject area, we're going to touch on some of the more the prevalent insects and plants that we may encounter throughout Ontario. So to start, just diving into a few different types of insects that we find that may be detrimental to when we disturb them. We have a variety of insects here shown. So we have our ants. So you can see the picture of those ants. I think everyone's familiar with what an ant looks like. But ants are basically everywhere, particularly when we get into the warmer months. They tend to be found underneath rocks, in logs, even as much as finding them in our soffits, within our homes, and so on. So most ants are not aggressive. They're not going to look to bite or harm a human, with the exception of some of the fire ant species that can have a stinging bite that can be quite harmful and create a burning sensation. Second, moving on to the middle there is our spiders. We do have a variety of spiders in Ontario. Now in Ontario, we only do have one type of venomous spider, that's the black widow. Not a very common spider, but just being mindful of the black widow being present in Ontario and having a venomous bite. The most common spider that we do have in Ontario, which that picture is showing, is the wolf spider. It is quite a large species and definitely does look a lot scarier than it is. It's actually quite harmless. Moving on to the third picture there, I have a few different types of stinging insects shown. So across the top, you have your bees. So these are a benefit to humans. Obviously, they are pollinators. They help us with our food crops throughout Ontario, amongst other locations. They tend to be obviously yellow and black in color and quite fuzzy. Now, they're not aggressive. They're not going to purposely harm you. They just are, they keep busy doing their own thing and will not try to attack. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is our wasps and our hornets. So we have our wasps there on the right-hand side. They have a very distinctive, typically yellow and black marking. In Ontario, our yellow jackets and paper wasps tend to be the most common of a wasp species. Now, these guys are attracted to sweet smells and bright colors and tend to be more aggressive and can sting multiple times. So these are the guys that you'd want to try to steer clear of. We have one flying around our head, trying not to swat at them. Because they are social, they will gang up as a pack and create a bunch of stings to whatever is disturbing their home or their territory. And then the last one in the bottom there is the hornet. So this is the largest of all three of the stinging species. They are much lighter in color. They tend to be more white or blackish than a typical yellow. And much like the wasps, they are more aggressive and have the capacities to sting multiple times. So a species that we do want to avoid if possible. For all three of these, both ant spiders and the stingers, essentially the main thing is to not disturb them, but if you do get bit or sting, to ensure you're cleaning that wound site thoroughly and seeking any medical attention if there's any adverse reaction. Okay, so significant swelling, if you're allergic, if perhaps it was a black widow bite, seeking that medical attention. Okay, so moving on to some other friends that we have in Ontario. These are considered our biting insects, and they tend to have a much shorter flight time than the stingers. So the thing to keep in mind with any of these types of biting insects is that humans are not their preferred food source. Okay, they have a different food source that they prefer to feed on. For example, in Canada, there's over 160 species of black flies, but only 4 of them will actually feed on human blood. So they're not going to prefer to feed on you if there's their preferred hosts there. So with these biting insects, we have our black flies. So that top picture on the right. Okay, so black flies basically land, and they act by cutting the skin and soaking up the blood. Then you have your mosquitoes just beside that. So these species pierce the skin and suck up the blood. Now keep in mind that a mosquito needs several beatings in order to produce a viable batch of eggs. So she can feed on several different hosts. Deer and horseflies across the bottom. So the deer on the left and the horse on the right. You can see there is a size difference with the horsefly being much larger. These guys, unlike the black flies and mosquitoes, which prefer dusk and dawn, these guys tend to be active all day. So, you know, when you're sitting on the beach and enjoying, these are the ones that fly around you. They're attracted to movement. So as you're swatting at them, you're basically telling them that, hey, I'm here, please come bite me. So a little bit different than the black flies and the mosquitoes, which tend to work on sensing dark colors and also our breathing. They're attracted to carbon dioxide, excuse me. So for all of these, the best thing to do is cover up with light colored clothing to protect yourself. And in the case of mosquitoes and black flies, insect repellents tend to be quite useful. Not so much for the deer and the horseflies. Okay, so just a quick note on West Nile virus. No surprise, this has been in the news quite frequently. We do have West Nile virus in Ontario. Essentially, it's a mosquito that has fed on an infected bird and then came and fed on a human, and they have passed on that virus to them. So in Ontario, there is some stats here. You can see in 2021, we had 25 cases resulting in 7 hospitalizations and 1 death. So the thing to keep in mind is you don't always feel ill if you've been exposed to West Nile. Only 1 in 5 may feel some fatigue or body aches, with a much smaller proportion developing some serious illness. Moving along to ticks. So ticks are the one that always make me a little bit nervous. So ticks are now found in most of Ontario and most of Canada. There are some pockets in certain areas of Ontario, particularly like the North Shore of Lake Erie, around Lake Ontario, and along the St. Lawrence River. And typically, as long as temperatures are above freezing, they can be active. So keep that in mind, that they're not limited necessarily to the spring and summer, but they will be more active during the times when it is warmer. So ticks don't jump or fly. They basically move between food sources by attaching themselves and jumping between animals. So encountering a tick is simply as easy as brushing across vegetation in a tick-dense area. In Ontario, we do have several species. Your most common I've listed here. One of the most important, which we're going to talk about in the next couple slides, is the black-legged or the deer tick. That is the one that you can see in the top left there. That tick species is the one that has the potential to carry Lyme disease. Okay, so Lyme disease results from the bite of an infected black-legged tick. Okay, so the black-legged ticks can potentially carry a bacteria, which is the cause of Lyme disease. Now, the thing to keep in mind is a tick must be attached for a significant time frame and feeding on its host for it to be able to pass that Lyme disease to the host. So typically between 24 and 48 hours is that time frame that the tick needs to feed in order to pass that bacteria on. You can see here in the picture, this is one of the early symptoms of Lyme disease. It's a ring-like rash or a bullseye that occurs around the location of the tick bite. Some other early symptoms, which can start anywhere from 3 days to a month after being bitten, are things like flu-like symptoms or just general fatigue. Now, Lyme disease is one of the main things that we hear about in regards to tick disease, but there's also several other types of disease that ticks can spread. So you may have heard of things like Rocky Mountain fever. So there's several different things that ticks can spread. So very important that you're aware of ticks. Just to kind of backtrack when I mentioned some of the areas. So this schematic I'm showing here, this is produced by Public Health Ontario each year, and it shows the Lyme disease map based on estimated risk areas. So you can see clearly that the Golden Horseshoe, so right around Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and across the North Shore of Lake Erie, there are estimated risk areas. Now tying into that, you can see some stats down the right side of the screen there. So between 2020 and 2021, you can see that the number of cases of Lyme disease per 100,000 people, it basically doubled. So the prevalence of tick-borne diseases is definitely increasing. Also, interestingly enough, is due to perhaps global warming and the climate changing, because ticks like the warmer temperatures, generally above 0 degrees, their range is actually increasing about 35 to 55 kilometers per year. So they're traveling farther and making a home in areas further and further than they were before. How to protect yourself from tick bites? Probably the most important thing is when you're out in nature, trying to stay on cleared pathways and away from areas that are not fully vegetated, you know, staying on paths, wearing long sleeve clothes, long pants. And as I always tell my children, do a tick check. So part of our daily activity after being outside is always doing a tick check. So generally looking over your body to make sure that you don't have a tick anywhere that has the potential to start feeding. Okay, so that wraps up the part about insects. I'm very briefly going to talk about some of the noxious weeds in Ontario. By all means, this is a non-exhaustive list, just addressing a few of the more common species that we see. So when I talk about noxious weeds in Ontario, I'm talking about the plants or the weeds that carry toxic compounds within them. So whether it be in the stems, the leaves, or the flowers. Exposure to these weeds can be through basically skin contact. You can inhale. So if there's any burning occurring of these weeds, you can inhale that smoke. You can ingest. There can be eye contact, several different ways. Whenever we come into contact with that sap, it has the potential to cause some pretty significant rashes, burns, or blisters to the skin, eye irritation, blindness, swelling of airways, and so on. So there is a whole list of noxious weeds in Ontario that is on the Ministry of Food and Rural Affairs. The four most common that we see in Southern Ontario include poison ivy, poison sumac, giant hogweed, and wild parsnip. So poison ivy, I think everyone knows what poison ivy is. And what I was taught when I was little, the leaves 3, leave it be. Now that's much easier said than abided by. So as many people know, poison ivy is very, very widespread. However, it's also not selective to a particular habitat. By that, I mean, we can find it in the center of a shaded wood. We can find it in swamp areas. It can be in sandy, dry areas. So it's not selective. The other thing is that their leaves and their appearance vary quite drastically. Okay, so sometimes the leaves are smooth-edged, sometimes they're jagged. Depending on the time of year, the leaves may be green, they may be red. And also, they can also be in vine form. So particularly along Lake Erie, it doesn't grow as a bush on the ground. It actually turns into a vine with the potential to climb trees and other vegetation. The most important thing about poison ivy is recognizing that it causes a significant allergic reaction. So that reaction is to an oil resin that's found in the leaves and stem. So once that oil gets on your skin, it has the potential to transfer from different body parts simply by touch. So it's very important if you've came into contact with poison ivy that you wash your skin immediately to prevent that oil from spreading to other parts of your body. Okay, so a few of the other species to just touch on very, very briefly. So to start, we have the poison sumac, which you can see on the left-hand side there. Poison sumac has a leaflet that has basically 7 to 13 leaves. You can see the picture showing what it looks like. It tends to like very damp areas. So this is distinctive for sumac because other species of non-poisonous sumac prefer actually very dry areas. So if you see sumac in a wet, swampy area, it's more than likely of the poison variety. It works the exact same way as poison ivy in that it has an oil in the sap in the sap that can be transmitted by leaves and stems and create a rash. Okay, it is a little bit more allergenic than poison ivy, so that rash could be a little bit more significant. In the center there, you have giant hogweed. So giant hogweed is an invasive species that has came from southwestern Asia. It's very, very large. It can get up to 6 meters in height, as you can see from that bottom picture. And it prefers soils that are not disturbed readily. So you may see this growing in ditches along roadsides, along fence lines, things like that. Now, this guy it has a sap that contains a toxin as well that causes a severe dermatitis. However, in addition to that, if the sap gets on your skin and is exposed to sunlight, it creates a very severe burn. Okay, so it's called phytophotodermatitis. That burn, the sunlight interacting with the sap, is very, very painful and creates scars that can last for years on your body. It also, if the sap gets into eyes, it can create temporary blindness. So pretty significant. Okay, the last one is wild parsnip. It's in the same species as giant hogweed, but nowhere near as large. So it only gets about 1/3 of the size and height and tends to grow in more of a dense stand in areas that are pretty disturbed. So abandoned yards, waste dumps, meadows, things like that. Again, just like giant hogweed, it works the exact same way with a sap that, if activated by the sunlight, creates a very intense burn. Okay, so noxious plants, just to wrap up how to stay safe. Number one is protecting your skin. Okay, so wearing long sleeves, long pants, gloves, boots, and anything that does come in contact with a noxious plant, ensuring that that clothes gets washed separately with very hot water and detergent. There are barrier skin creams that may offer some protection, but that long sleeve is going to be your ultimate protection. If you've been using tools to cut, brush, or work in areas where these plants may grow, important to clean the tools with rubbing alcohol and also wear gloves while you do that. And also not to burn any brush piles that have the potential to have these plants. Stay on dedicated walks and pathways, and also educate yourself on what plants might be present in your area and learn how to identify them. On that note, I thank you, and I'm going to pass on to my colleague Taylor to talk to you a little bit about water safety.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. And I'm excited to walk us through the water safety section. So the first topic that I really wanted to talk about when it comes to water safety is some of the workplace regulations about working in or near water. So the first 3 regulations that I have listed on the screen there are probably the ones that we're most familiar with. Ontario Regulation 213 and 851, which are for construction projects and industrial establishments, and also the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. So in the sections that I've highlighted on the screen there, those are where there's specific mention where if there's a hazard of falling into water or when someone's working around water, what sort of precautions need to be taken. So this can include things like life jackets and personal flotation devices, developing rescue plans, and what type of rescue equipment needs to be there as well. There are also some more specific regulations for specific industries. So Ontario Regulation 629 for occupational diving activities, and then the Canadian Fishing Vessel Safety Regulations for commercial fishing vessels. So the first water safety topic I wanted to talk about is drowning. And drowning is defined as the process of experiencing respiratory impairment from either submersion or immersion in liquid. So by respiratory impairment, we're really meaning any sort of abnormal functioning of the respiratory system. So things like coughing, choking, or difficulty breathing. And then the difference between submersion and immersion is when you've gone below the surface of a liquid, while immersion is just being within that liquid itself. So there are 2 types of drowning. The first is fatal drowning, where unfortunately the person does die as a result of the drowning event. And then there's non-fatal drowning, where the person does survive that drowning event. Now, non-fatal drowning can be further differentiated based on the level of impairment that someone experiences after the event. So say some individuals may experience little to no impairment. They may continue to involuntarily cough and maybe feeling fatigued after this event, but otherwise no real long-term consequences, while others may experience things like infections due to water entering their lungs
or due to lack of oxygen, they may experience brain or other organ damage. So moving into some of the fatal drowning statistics, I just wanted to highlight the true issue. And this is specifically for Ontario, and this is provided in the Ontario Drowning Report, and all of this data is freely available. This organization also does make resources for fatal drowning statistics, not only across Canada, but the individual provinces as well. So if you are interested, I can definitely send you that information. So one thing that I really want to emphasize here is that water-related fatalities are universally underreported. So it's not just a provincial issue or even just a Canada-wide issue, it's across the globe. So really this is a true underestimation of the true burden that this does have. So from 2008 to 2017, which is the last available data that we had, a total of 1,601 individuals fatally drowned. And this is about an average of 160 people fatally drowning per year. Looking into some of the demographical data that we have, we can see that there is a very clear divide in terms of males versus females who are fatal drowning victims, with 77% of all fatal drowning victims in Ontario being males and 23% being females. We can also see that there are three main age groups that are contributing to fatal drowning statistics. And these include those aged 20 to 34, 50 to 64, and those 65 plus, and they make up almost 75% of all fatal drowning victims. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in Ontario, we do have access to a lot of amazing natural bodies of water, things like lakes, ponds, and rivers. However, unfortunately, this is where the majority of fatal drownings do occur, with about 64% happening in natural bodies of water. Finally, I wanted to look at some of the why, so some of the risk factors behind fatal drownings. So starting on the left side of the screen, for children less than 5 years of age, in 92% of all fatal drownings, supervision was either absent or distracted. So this is why it's so incredibly important for a parent, caregiver, or other adult to be supervising this vulnerable age group when they're either in the water or even near the water. So as we move to the right side of the screen, this is more just highlighting the different risk factors that are present across the lifespan. So looking at young adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults, there are generally three main factors that go into fatal drowning cases. So in the orange graph here, this represents where life jackets or other personal flotation devices were not used. And this accounts for at least 80% of all fatal drowning cases that these devices were not used. Alcohol consumption, as indicated by this red portion here, plays a fairly significant role in fatal drowning cases involving young adults and middle-aged adults, and lesser so for older adults. And then this blue bar here, which represents being near or in the water alone, it definitely has a trend where it's more of a risk factor the older that you get. So moving away from drowning, the second water safety hazard that I wanted to talk about is hypothermia. Now, hypothermia, this is defined as a core body temperature below 35 degrees Celsius. And for reference, a normal human core body temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius. So we're talking about very, very small changes between normal body functioning and hypothermia. Now, hypothermia is caused by prolonged exposure to very cold temperatures. Now, this can be very cold air temperatures, like what happens when we think of wind chill, or very cold water. Now, if we're talking about exposure to cold water, we use the term immersion hypothermia. Although immersion hypothermia and general hypothermia, the symptoms are still the same. Cold, pale, and dry skin, shivering, feeling tired and confused and disoriented, eventually moving into irrational behavior, slowed and shallowed breathing, slow and weakened pulse, and potentially a loss of consciousness. And you might be asking yourself, you know, Taylor, it's super warm outside. Why are we worried about hypothermia? Unfortunately, when it comes to water, it isn't just a winter concern. So the major point that I want to bring up with hypothermia, especially in the summer, it's more associated with our natural bodies of water, our rivers, lakes, ponds, and oceans. Because across Canada, it does take a while for these bodies of water to warm up, even if we have the sun beating down on it for days and days on end, and we've got air temperatures in the mid to high 30s. And this is in part due to water having a naturally high heat capacity. And what I mean by a high heat capacity is that it takes a lot of energy to increase the temperature of water. And because it takes a lot of energy to increase the temperature of water, water is a very excellent medium to be stealing heat away from other objects that are within it, say a person going swimming. And this is actually happens at a quicker rate in water than it does in air. So one thing that I wanted to look into is comparing some of the average water temperatures we see here in Lake Ontario in some of the summer months compared to some of the hypothermia related benchmarks that we might see. So even though we have had some great weather in May and June with some fairly high temperatures, we can see that over the last 5 years, the average water temperature in Lake Ontario in May is about 6.3 degrees Celsius. In June, we're getting up to about 13.5, while July, August, and September, we're finally breaking that 20 degrees Celsius barrier. So if we look at the chart on the right, this is a chart adapted from the University of Minnesota, where it's comparing the water temperatures to these series of different benchmarks related to hypothermia. So this includes things like loss of dexterity, which is issues being able to grasp an object or hold on to something, say a rescue buoy being thrown to you, becoming exhausted or unconscious, and without a flotation device like a life jacket, subsequently drowning, as well as the likely survival time with flotation, again, like a life jacket or a personal flotation device. So if we look for May, we can see that the loss of dexterity is occurring in less than 5 minutes, while you're becoming exhausted or unconscious in about 30 to 60 minutes, meaning if you don't have a life jacket on, there's a potential for drowning in that short period of time. As well, the likely survival time with a flotation device is about 2 to 3 hours. As we move on into June, we do see that we do have longer periods of time before these benchmarks are hit. So we see that for 13.5 degree water, the loss of dexterity isn't occurring until about 10 to 15 minutes, which is still a really short period of time. You're becoming exhausted or unconscious in about 1 to 2 hours, and your likely survival time is about 3 to 5 hours. Moving into temperatures that we'll see in July and September, we are even increasing it even further, with our likely survival time with flotation being upwards of 17 hours. So hypothermia and subsequently fatal drowning is a very real possibility in Ontario during the summer months, especially if you don't have a life jacket or a personal flotation device, which is why it's so critical to not only have these devices available, but to also be wearing them while you're in or near the water, because at the bare minimum, they're at least doubling your survival time should you fall into the water. So wrapping this up, I definitely wanted to highlight some ways that you can not only protect your family, yourself, your colleagues, and your friends as well. There are so many different ways that you can do this. So I really do hope that you adopt at least a few of these moving forward. So the first is when you're on docks or near water, wearing footwear with slip-resistant soles. This can help prevent slip hazards. You also always want to be wearing an approved life jacket or personal flotation device. For your personal use, you want to make sure that it's approved to Canadian standards. So by Transport Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, or the Canadian Coast Guard. I also highly recommend making sure that it's very brightly colored, has reflective straps, and has an option to attach a pee whistle, because these can aid rescuers in finding you should you fall in. You also want to be regularly inspecting this rescue equipment and personal protective equipment as well. So with life jackets especially, you want to be testing them before you use them, making sure that it's still buoyant, so it'll still be able to keep you afloat. that any sort of fastening systems like zippers or buckles are still intact, that the straps aren't being worn down, and that there's no other damage that could impair its ability to protect you. In the workplace, you always want to be having an emergency response plan, and the legislation does delve a little bit deeper into things that you should be including in this as well. So I encourage you to consult that. You also want to be using a buddy or a check-in system. This way you have someone who's either right alongside you or someone who knows of your activities and can signal for help should the need arise. Say they witness you fall into the water or you don't check in at a predetermined time. If you take anything away from this section, I definitely recommend learning how to swim. As a former lifeguard, I personally believe that everyone should know how to swim and know the basics on how to survive. And there are so many great organizations, whether it be through organizations like the YMCA or local aquatic centers that do offer different programming that can teach you these basic skills that can be life-saving. Just a few more tips to wrap it up. Unfortunately, avoiding the use of alcohol, drugs, or certain medications. I know that everyone loves it being summer, everyone wants to be having fun, but unfortunately, alcohol, drugs, and these prescription medications do not mix with water. They can impair your judgment and your coordination, and it can lead to deadly consequences. You always want to be supervising children when they're in the water. As a general rule for younger children, adults should be within an arm's length of their children when they're in the water, whether it be at a pool, at a beach, or even just in the bathtub. You want to be aware of any hazards below the water. So if you're in your man-made bodies of water like pools, this is being aware of things like filters and drain grates, where they can suck in hair and jewelry and potentially lead to someone becoming stuck. And when we're looking at natural bodies of water, thinking about things like the visibility, the depth and any potential drop-offs, rips or currents, and any sort of obstacles like rocks or logs where you could become entangled. You also want to stay within your abilities because at this point, you know what's best. You know your abilities the best, and you need to trust your gut. And if you think that, I really don't feel comfortable going out a little bit further, listen to that voice in the back of your head. Additionally, you want to heed the advice of lifeguards. They are trained on how to protect you, and they want to keep you safe and make sure that your day at the beach is fun and doesn't end in tragedy. And finally, consider installing additional protective measures such as alarm systems or pool covers around pools on your property. And these can serve to supplement the fencing and the gate requirements that many municipalities and cities have across Ontario and give you that extra layer of safety. So I'm going to turn things over to Marianne to take us through heat stress as well as related to hazards for wildfire smoke.
Well, thank you very much, Taylor and Lisa. I will talk briefly about heat stress. And if there's anything I want to tell you about heat stress, is I can't tell you everything about heat stress in the amount of time I have. So please do learn more and ask ECHO for more information if you need it. It's probably no surprise to you that it's getting hotter out there. And this is a chart from Health Canada that shows the expected days above 30 degrees. And as you can see, as we get through our century, it will get hotter and hotter. There will be many more days when it is above 30. And heat stress can be fatal. Another key message I want to stress for you. The heat wave that BC experienced in 2021 led to 619 heat-related deaths. Ontario's Workers' Compensation reports 828 lost time claims for heat illness. That's just not fatalities, since 2012. And here you see an excerpt from a coroner's report from an Ontario guide that talks about the tragic death of a college student because the employer and the student did not recognize the symptoms of heat stress when he was experiencing them. Just a bit about definitions. We talk about heat stress, but that is not really the illness itself. It's the conditions that affect us. So it includes the environmental heat as well as metabolic load and clothing, whereas heat strain is the body's reaction to heat stress. And here's another diagram from that same guide from Health Canada, which is really worth looking at in some detail. It describes all the things that affect how your body is going to react to heat, as well as the thermoregulation mechanisms. Those are the mechanisms by which the body will try to regulate and keep a consistent internal temperature, which often is not enough. Mainly it's from sweating. So we sweat and the water evaporates from our skin, and that serves to cool us. As well, our blood vessels dilate, and that increases the convection and conduction heat loss to the environment. We get better at thermoregulation with acclimatization. In other words, spending some time in the heat, working in the heat, will improve our ability to thermoregulate. So when people first start working in the heat, they will not be as good as at thermoregulation after they've been in it for a few weeks. So here are the heat-related illnesses, a very complicated chart I'm not going to go through. It is available through the Canadian Centre, ECOH, but the main message we want to get across here is heat stroke can be fatal. It's often fatal. Heat effects progress from swelling of the feet and ankles up through heat stroke, which is a medical emergency. It's really important to be aware of those signs and to respond if somebody is getting into trouble with heat stress. So what does the Ontario law say about heat stress? Well, some jurisdictions require a heat stress program and plan in a workplace, but Ontario uses the general duty clause, the one that says do everything you can to protect the worker. Its website says the employer should implement a heat stress prevention program, including these things that you see here, but it is not a specific regulation. Now, how do we assess heat stress? Well, there are a number of different ways of doing that, a number of different indices, and it does get complicated. So what I've shown in this slide is an instrument for measuring what we call wet bulb globe temperature, or WBGT. And this isn't the only one, it's just an example I grabbed from the web. So we may use different ones, and we're not endorsing a particular instrument. But the main thing about WBGT is it takes into account a number of factors, which includes air movement and air temperature, radiant heat from the sun or from hot equipment if you're working near it, whether indoors or outdoors, and humidity. So you need some special instruments to measure that. And the WBGT indices are different for indoors compared to outdoors, because outdoors you get the radiant heat from the sun. As well, when we apply the WBGT, there need to be adjustments based on clothing, whether the worker is acclimatized or not, and work intensity. And I did want to mention other jurisdictions use other indices. So WBGT is not used everywhere. ECHO is familiar with one called the thermal work limit, because we used that in a study we did in the Middle East. And without going into detail, I just want to use the third graph here, which shows that using the TWL, there were many more conditions that were acceptable compared to WBGT. So some countries have such hot conditions, they could not possibly comply with the ACGAH limits, and they have to use something else, but they have to have other ways of protecting their workers. Now, here's an example of the screening tool that's used by the ACGIH. And essentially, it's complicated. So I don't have time to explain it. The main message I want to tell you is it's complicated. So it needs some study. Again, something ECHO can help you with. But you do need to pay attention to this if you have workers who are working in the heat. And basically what it says is you need to take into account acclimatization, work intensity, work rest periods, and clothing. Now there's a somewhat simpler way of assessing heat conditions, and one is provided by Environment Canada, which essentially you probably know when the weather says it's 25 degrees, but it feels like 30, that's because they're taking into account the relative humidity. So this is the chart they have to do that. So relative humidity on this axis and the temperature on the vertical axis, and you can look up the humidex. An easier way is to look at the weather report, or to use OCAL's, Occupational Health Clinic for Ontario Workers, calculator. And this is an example I plugged in. You can plug in the temperature and the humidity and calculate, and it will tell you not only the humidex, but also give you some tips about working safely. Now, very important thing to remember is that individual factors can affect reaction to heat stress. So it's not just those external conditions you have to look at. You have to consider what either your own or your workers' individual reaction might be. And these are affected by age, medical conditions, medicine, drugs, weight, and individual susceptibility. So it's really important to monitor how individuals are reacting, not just look at environmental conditions. And ACGH TLVs now include a detailed section on physiological monitoring. And there's some new monitors that we have, sort of like a Fitbit, but this one's put on the arm, to monitor those physiological reactions to make sure your workers are not getting in trouble. There are other indices and apps, some for phones, some desktop, which are good. This one by the IRSST in Quebec. And you really need to know not only how to recognize heat stress, but how to prevent it. So if you're responsible for a workplace, it's very important to educate any workers who may be working in the heat to make sure that they become acclimatized, to have an emergency response plan if someone gets into trouble with heat stress, and to make sure they're hydrated. So really, really important. People may not feel thirsty, but it's extremely important that they drink enough water when subject to heat stress. So here's what the CDC in the US recommends: 1 cup every 15 minutes, as well as shade, work rest cycles, etc. Now I'm running out of time. We wanted to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to just mention very briefly, it's not just the heat, it's also the sun. I think people know the sun can cause skin cancer. So if your workers are working in the sun, or you are, make sure you take precautions to protect against that. And you can check the UV report, which tells you how bad the solar UV is on that day, and take these precautions that you see here. So here's a summary. And again, I've mentioned some of these things in the interest of time. I won't go through this in detail. Happy to make the slides available, but do remember this is very serious. Heat stroke is a medical emergency and you need to prevent it as well as react to it if it occurs. Now, in addition to heat stroke and heat stress, we have another summer problem, which I'm sure today you may be well aware of, is wildfire smoke. And it's especially bad today. So wildfire smoke contains a mix of particles and gases. A particularly concern is fine particles, which we label PM2.5, that's related to the diameter size. And so to assess the risk, you can check your local, it's called Air Quality Health Index, which is based on ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and PM2.5. And I just pasted in here the one for today in Toronto, which is extremely bad. This was at 10 a.m. It's 4 today, which is only medium, but they're actually predicting high risk later today of 9, which is quite high. So you may need to take steps to protect yourself against that smoke. Possible health effects can be headache, and especially respiratory problems and irritation. So ways of protecting yourself against wildfire smoke: stay indoors if possible when levels are high, check those levels with the ECOH. If you can, put a MERV 13 or better filter on your ventilation system or your home system. You can use air purifiers with HEPA filters. In fact, I have mine chugging along, which I got during COVID, and now I'm using it for the smoke. And similarly with those masks that we got for COVID, I'm wearing an N95 respirator when I go out today because I am quite sensitive to the smoke. So they will filter those particles. They won't filter the gases, but they will filter the particles, and that's going to be really important. So with that, I just wanted to let you know that ECHO can help you with all this. We can perform heat exposure assessments and develop a heat stress plan and program for you. We conduct particulate monitoring if you're concerned about that, and provide advice on ventilation and respiratory protection, and also help you complete a summer safety program. We have many years of experience in providing this kind of tailored service to our clients, both in Canada, Ontario, and around the world. So with that, I think we now can have a brief question period, and I'm turning it back to Gnomes. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Marianne, and all of our presenters. That was super informative. We have a series of questions from a couple of people in the Q&A. If you do have any questions whatsoever, please pop them in there. Even if we're not able to get to them today, our presenters will get back to you via email, so they will be answered. To just touch on perhaps one or two, Atif Mohammed put up a couple questions for our different presenters here. Maybe we'll just start with Taylor, and if we don't get through the others, Atif, we'll make sure that we answer them via email. Taylor, are you aware of the drowning statistics in 2014? There was a decline in the amount of drownings from the previous year by a factor of about 30. Was there any information on these factors which contributed to the decline? Are you aware of that, or do you want to do a little bit of research to get back to Atif with that question?
So in preparation for this presentation, there wasn't any, say, specific information on 2014 specifically. However, I would definitely look into specifically for the year 2014, see if they are mentioning anything, if there's any data missing or any sort of other characteristics that could explain that. Because you're right, it is a bit more of a significant decrease than what you would expect, but I can definitely get back to you.
All right, thank you. For Lisa, he asks that if giant hogweed is present, what is the best approach to remove the plants? Should the flowering sections be removed first, then the stems, or the entire plant at once? Is there any recommended PPE to be used and then disposed of as regular yard waste or kept separate? So that's a pretty involved question. I don't know if that's something that you can answer right now, or if you want to get back to him on email later, but
yeah, no. For giant hogweed, it's basically the entire plant carries the sap, right? So because it gets so tall, I mean, you may need to cut it down in sections. Ideally, if you pull it by the root, that would be probably your best bet. But definitely wearing full sleeves, gloves. I would also wear some kind of face protection, just because it can cause temporary blindness. So just protecting your whole body, cleaning that PPE when you're done. And then for disposal, it can go as regular yard waste, but I would try to segregate it a bit. So for example, if you're putting it at your curb, I would try to tape those bags closed or something like that, just so that the waste disposal workers aren't coming into contact. Maybe even just alerting them that it is a noxious weed, so they take precautions.
Great advice. Thanks, Lisa. And then probably just our last question is for Marianne. We'll get to the other ones later, I think, but just developing work rest schedule for outdoor workers, taking into account factors such as clothing, acclimatization, etc. Is the average daily temperature for an 8-hour workday used at all to determine the work rest schedule, or should average be taken every 2 or 4 hour segments? Great question.
Well, okay, so the WBGT limits in that chart I showed you, it's not based on an average, an 8-hour average. It's based on the immediate conditions, because in many places it could be very cold in the morning and then warm during the day, and that's when you want to protect people. So I would say even a 2-hour average or a 4-hour average may not be enough. You want to be able to monitor. Obviously things don't change that fast, but you want to know what the conditions are at the time that a worker is working. So measure the WBGT at the hottest part of the day when people are working, and then plan the work race schedules according to that.
Thank you. Yeah. And Ina says, check the weather data. Maybe it was a cooler year. Well known that the risk of drowning is related to outdoor temperature. More folks on or in the water. Really good point. We have time for just one more question here. And it's from an anonymous attendee. I suppose related to heat acclimatization, how long does it take to become acclimatized to heat?
So the general rule is about 2 weeks. Sometimes it can be less, but it's good to allow 2 weeks. And there's kind of a schedule for acclimatizing. So when somebody's trying to become acclimatized, say it's just the beginning of the season, you should plan a work schedule that gradually increases the amount of work each day. And without getting into a lot of detail on this, there is some good guidance from the US NIOSH site about what is a good schedule for developing acclimatization. The other thing to remember is if you are acclimatized and then you go on vacation and you're kind of just lying around not working hard for a week or so, and then you come back, you do have to re-acclimatize. So just don't jump back into your regular schedule. It won't take you as long to re-acclimatize as to acclimatize in the first place if it's just a 1 or 2 week gap, but that you do have to re-acclimatize. So don't forget about that.
Thank you. Very helpful. We're going to leave the question about ticks for now. I just wanted to thank everybody for their time, and I'd really appreciate if you could take a couple minutes at the end of the webinar just to fill out your thoughts and let us know if there's any improvements that we can make for next time. I would also love to have you join us on LinkedIn. We post a lot of useful tips about summer safety and a bunch of occupational health and environmental challenges and answers to that. We're always posting up on that. And we'd like to wish you a happy and safe summer. Thank you very much for your time with us today, and thanks again to all of our presenters. We'll see you in the fall.